Good evening, everybody. We're here with another presentation for our winter presentation series. And we are here today with actually our president of the organization, Micah Kipple. He is going to be presenting on his research on Mickey Hot Springs in Oregon. And with that, we will go ahead and take it over to Micah.
Hey everyone, I'm Micah, GOSA president. Many of you know me personally in Yellowstone or from my contributions to the Geyser Sput. Launching right in here, just a little bit about me. I first encountered thermal features and their activity during a family visit to Yellowstone in 2007. I returned in 2012 to watch the thermal features specifically and fell into the ranks of the Geyzers. And then I returned to work seasonally in Yellowstone for 6 summers and 2 winters, geyser gazing on my off time. In 2018, I received my Bachelor of Science in Geological Sciences from Central Washington University, which is when much of the information in this presentation was gathered during my undergraduate. I currently live and work at Tano Natural Bridge State Park in the mountains of central Arizona, making a trip to Yellowstone once a year. Before we get started here, we'd be here for over an hour if I listed all the names involved with what went into this presentation tonight and the undergraduate study at Central Washington University. So I would just like to extend a blanket thank you to all observers of Mickey Hot Springs over the years, from GOSA, universities, private visitors, and otherwise, and a thank you to the Bureau of Land Management staff of the Burns Field Office in Oregon for managing and protecting this fantastic thermal area. So there's a lot to cover tonight, but we're going to try to do it in less than an hour. So this presentation is going to summarize Mickey Hot Springs' history, geology, and thermal activity, which spans about from 1980 to 2024 in terms of thermal activity. This is not going to be a comprehensive report, but just a quick overview of what to expect if you're going to visit the springs for the first time or you have no idea about this thermal area in southeastern Oregon. And maybe some inspiration on why you should visit. I can't get into details about specific topics tonight for the sake of time, and I've even left out some of the less important thermal features entirely. If you want more clarification on a specific subject, please write your questions in the chat box at the end, and I will answer it to the best of my ability. You can also always email me at micahkipple@gmail.com or mkipple@gosa.org. Now, Mickey Hot Springs, as you can see here, is in southeast Oregon, and it is most easily reached from near the city of Burns from Oregon State Route 78, running east from Burns to Burns Junction, which is just over here, and then it runs east to Boise, Idaho. The Fields de Neo Road intersects with Oregon 78 just southeast of Baker Pass over Steens Mountain and runs south through the Alvord Valley to De Neo, Nevada. Most of Fields de Neo Road is unpaved, but usually well maintained and easy with a two-wheel vehicle. The turnoff for Mickey Hot Springs is approximately 30 miles south of the junction of the Fields de Neo Road and Oregon Route 78, just as the Fields de Neo Road takes a sharp bend to the right. Continuing down takes you to the tiny town of Fields, Oregon, where there's a small motel, gas station, and diner. But turning down Mickey Hot Springs Access Road, I recommend a high clearance vehicle or four-wheel drive, or if you're the visitor here, who several of you may already know exactly who that is, they did it just fine in a sedan. It is re-graveled and graded by the BLM several times a year. Now, the access road, as you can see here, does cross this little playa shortly before the springs. In March of 2017, I was delayed from reaching Mickey Hot Springs because this playa was full of water and there were waves lapping over the road. So be sure to check the weather beforehand. Mickey Hot Springs is exceptionally remote. There is no potable water or shade nearby. So I do recommend proper amounts of fuel, water, food, sun, and wind protection for a stay of any length. I also have seen critters like rattlesnakes, so please use caution when exploring the springs and surrounding areas. You can camp at the springs. Um, so pack a tent, and there is a fire area and sandy area for you to pitch your tent right across from the entrance gate to the springs themselves. If you're not into dispersed camping, alternatively, on the Fields de Neo Road that you use to access the springs, a developed campground is available at Man Lake with vault toilets managed by the BLM. Mickey Hot Springs lies in the Alvord Valley of southeastern Oregon at an elevation of about 4,000 feet, directly east of 9,700 foot Steens Mountain. This thermal area is part of the Basin and Range province, which spans multiple western states, and it's where North America is stretching apart east to west. This extension creates a series of slowly dropping grabens, or valleys, bounded by tall ridges or mountain ranges. The Alvord Valley is one of these, having dropped thousands of feet since 11 million years ago. Before and during the beginning of extension in Mickey Hot Springs, the entire region was subject to intense volcanism, depositing large sheets of fragmented material known as tuff. This tuff makes up a large portion of underground and may be the source of the center that you see at Mickey Hot Springs. The dominating rock in the area is basalt, of the Columbia River basalts, which was all erupted about 17 to 15 million years ago by the birth or resurgence of the Yellowstone hotspot beneath northwest Nevada. The valley floors at Mickey Hot Springs are filled by sediment eroded off of high ridges and buttes, which can be several thousand feet thick in places. Low areas, as we discussed with Mickey Playa, are occupied by several seasonal lake beds. During and following the most recent ice age, 20 to 15,000 years ago, an Alvord Valley was filled with a lake called Glacial Lake Alvord. This lake got big enough that it actually covered up Mickey Hot Springs, and when it covered up Mickey Hot Springs at that time, we're still not sure why cinder deposition at the springs stopped. But the lake did leave the area covered in a huge deposit of very fine powdery material that accumulated at the bottom of the lake and then was left to the elements when the lake evaporated away. Continued extension and tectonic movement in the area has created multiple active faults that run parallel to the ridges in the area, and the valley lurches downward on these faults in occasional earthquakes. Recent earthquake activity here, you can see the fault scarps on your way to Mickey Hot Springs. Mickey Hot Springs itself is basically at the intersection of two major faults, and in the middle of that intersection is just geologic chaos where hot water can reach the surface, creating the springs that we see on the surface today. So, in terms of a history, records of Mickey Hot Springs go back at least as far as the 1960s. Mickey Springs is the officially recognized name, but Mickey Hot Springs is also recognized as a variant. Most scientific papers and federal records use the variant name, and this presentation is going to follow this format, and that's how it's been referenced throughout various studies. As one of Oregon's hottest and best situated thermal areas, Mickey Hot Springs has frequently attracted interest as a possible location for geothermal power development. Multiple geothermal leases and proposals were suggested throughout the 1970s and 80s for the springs, but fortunately none of them were successful. Now, in October of 2000, President Clinton signed the Steens Mountain Cooperative Management and Protection Act. This act designated Mickey Hot Springs as an area of critical environmental concern and protected it and all of Alvord Valley's thermal areas, there's two additional ones, from geothermal development. So it's protected for the future. As part of its designation as this ACEC, Mickey Hot Springs is minimally developed and maintained by the Bureau of Land Management. There's a parking area and signed gate, and then there's a fire pit and open area for dispersed camping across the road. The whole area is also surrounded by a fence to protect it from grazing cattle. Now, Mickey Hot Springs has been the site of many scientific investigations, primarily focused on geothermal energy, thermophilic biology, and geologic structure. Early BLM documents only mention Mickey in passing. I've gone through a lot of papers, and it's literally usually a sentence or two. The BLM did conduct a detailed study on Mickey Hot Springs in the first half of the 1990s, and this study introduced several unofficial names for features that are used in this presentation. In 1993, Geyser associate Jeff Cross published the first comprehensive study of the thermal area in Volume 4 of the Geyser Transactions. Two additional transactions were published in Volume 12, 2 articles. And in addition to transactions, the Geyser Sput newsletter has published various reports on Mickey Hot Springs since the 1990s to the present day. In the photo here, these are actually early Geyser associates looking at Mickey Geyser when it was first reported by the Bureau of Land Management. Now, from the 1980s to as recently as 2021, Michael Cummings of Portland State University has been studying Mickey Hot Springs, and him and his students have published several research articles throughout the years, the most recent being in 2021, which does cite Geyser work from Jeff Cross and myself. So there's been a lot of work done recently, and this is kind of just a compilation of everything that we've been found so far. Now, thermal features at Mickey Hot Springs have received a serial number. This numbering system is based off of Jeff Cross's 1993 report. The designation that goes in front of this number is UTF, or Unnamed Thermal Feature. This designation in front of the serial number allows for features to change their appearance and behavior while reducing the risk of misidentification in the future. For example, UTF-15, which we'll discuss later, has been a hot spring, mud pot, and a fumarole interchangeably throughout the decades of observation. So we use unnamed thermal feature number 15 instead of hot spring 15 or geyser 15 to allow for those changes to take place. Now, Mickey Hot Springs has 30 major hydrothermal features naturally separated into 2 geographic clusters, the upper group and the lower group. All thermal features lie within the boundary of the Area of Critical Environmental Concern, or ACEC. And like I mentioned earlier, with our limited time, we're only going to touch on some of the more significant features that you'll see on your visit. And things are generally described closest to the parking lot to farthest to the parking lot. So, starting with the upper group, on the right here is a sketch map based on satellite imagery I drew. The parking area is going to be off screen here to the left with the access road going here to the left. And then here's all your various features. Now, the upper group of Mickey Hot Springs resembles a hydrothermal graveyard. The few active springs are scattered amongst the husks of previous features, prehistoric features like you see here in the photo on the left. And the whole area is underlaid with a center shield dotted with over a dozen of these various center formations, cones, craters, you name it. Several of which have been dated to over 15,000 years old. There's such a number of these old features that in its prime, I imagine the upper group of Mickey Hot Springs must have been an impressive collection of active springs and geysers that may have been similar to the north portion of the Geyser Hill group in Yellowstone. Mantling large portions of the upper group as you walk through it is a blanket of lake sediments left behind when Glacial Lake Alvord evaporated thousands of years ago. The upper group has 7 active thermal features, which are UTFs 1 through 7, and we're going to discuss only 2 tonight. So, UTF-1, Morning Glory Pool, that's one of the unofficial names that was given to it by the Bureau of Land Management in their 1992 study. This feature is the first one you're going to encounter when entering Mickey Hot Springs. And it is the largest spring in the group by both volume and size. The spring is circular, approximately 30 feet in diameter, and is circled by an ancient center rim. Thick mats of bacteria line the spring and extend down into its vent. The discharge from UTF-1 exits the spring through an artificial trench and a pipe's been laid through that to capture the discharge, and then it gets funneled into a dugout basin, occasionally used for recreational soaking by visitors to the springs. I personally wouldn't recommend it, but that's what that's been dug out for. After exiting this soaking pool, the runoff flows down the slope, creating a small thermal wetland. There's Steens Mountain in the background there, so you're looking west in this photo. Further down the slope from UTF-1 is UTF-4. Now, this is a tepid-looking pool that you can see is tucked underneath a ledge of sinter in an old crater. The modern spring has a single pool that's brown or gray, and it has bacteria mats in it. The temperature that I measured in 2018 was about 125 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, while this pool it looks calm and cool, it actually has erupted twice in history. Uh, in 1995, the BLM noted that there was evidence of an eruptive event. The crater floor had some mud scattered around. But in 2014, a geology student found evidence of a similar event, reporting that the eruption covered the entire crater floor with mud, killed this shrub in the crater, and then it actually put mud and debris 10 feet outward from this crater. So it must have been one large event. This is one of the springs I decided to feature it in this presentation because the presence of two eruptions in historical times from this feature shows that we should probably keep an eye on it whenever we visit to look for future evidence of eruptions. Now, the lower group of Mickey Hot Springs, which we're going to get into in a second here, is going to be the most significant thermal activity has occurred here in the springs. There's 23 thermal features scattered here, but they're all clustered together in less than an acre. Most features lie in a large, shallow depression ringed by a ridge of loose sediment. And the center shield that you see in the upper group is buried by a lot of the sediments here in the lower group. The upper group doesn't have a whole lot of discharge. The lower group has a massive amount of discharge, which exits through a runoff channel here down to the south that eventually flows all the way out of the ACEC. And at least when I was there in 2017 and 18, it did have quite a colorful bacteria mat. Now, the first feature that we see in the lower group is Oasis Spring here. This is a delightful little hot spring. It's small, but it's relatively pretty. It's about 3 feet in diameter and lined with bacteria. Throughout most of its observed history, it's overflowed in all sorts of different directions. But the name Oasis Spring is, I've suggested it, it's my suggestion, based on the fact that when you're walking through the area, there's this kind of lush oasis of vegetation around it. I've seen rabbits and lizards running around. It's just kind of this isolated, cute little spring that seems a little out of place compared to the rest of the group. Now, UTF-13 here, this is Mickey's famous mud pot. It's situated at the bottom of a small crater at the edge of a large mound of fine material, and its activity, like with most mud pots, is largely dependent on groundwater levels and recent precipitation. Occasionally, as you can see here on the right photo, the activity does create cute little mud chimneys and mud volcanoes that are several inches high. Now, another thing to note for any of you that are thinking about visiting Mickey, this is another feature that, although it seems innocuous, it has erupted in the past or exploded or done something. That same researcher in 2014 that saw UTF-4 had erupted did also see that around the same time, UTF-13 had scattered debris and rocks for several feet from its crater. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye on. Now moving into some of the more interesting features of the lower group. We're getting to the geyser, I promise. This is UTF-14, which has been named by researchers Murky Pot. Now, this feature is about 120 degrees as of 2018, and murky with floating debris. But in 2007, biologists discovered that in this spring there is an arsenic metabolizing bacteria that eats arsenic and it poops out realgar. This was only discovered in 2007, and the form of realgar that's made by these bacterium has never been known to be created by biological processes before. So not only is Mickey Hot Springs important in terms of thermal activity and of interest to geyser enthusiasts, but also to biological research. UTF 15, just near UTF 14, this is a feature that's worn a lot of different hats. It's dubbed the Cool Pool by observers in the early 90s, and it's changed multiple times. It was a small, cool hot spring in the 90s, but at some point, the hot spring disappeared, and all it was a patch of warm ground with soil. In May of 2017, I came to the springs and saw that UTF 15 had broken back out. Um, a new 6 foot wide hot spring had emerged, and mud covered a large swath of the ground down slope, and vegetation had been matted down, pointing away from the feature, suggesting a heavy discharge or maybe of an eruption of some kind when it broke out. Now, throughout the rest of that summer, it did cool down and eventually lost all thermal heat to the point where reeds could be growing in its crater. And I imagine if it goes without thermal activity for much longer, it's going to become this area of dry ground and maybe even be covered by vegetation again. Now, these two springs have one slide and one description because even though they are two separate features here, we have UTF 18 and UTF 17 in the back. These springs are connected on the surface in a large pear-shaped pool, as you can see, supporting heavy mats of bacteria. The temperature of this lower pool is about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and have heard that in the past it's been used as a swimming hole. Don't dive into this one though, because UTF 18 was almost 150 degrees when I measured it in 2018. Now, back in the 90s, these two springs here contributed to a lot of the discharge of the lower group. But when I was studying this area for my undergraduate in 2017 and 18, that was not the case. They were putting out very little discharge. Now, UTF 19, we're getting closer to the hotter and more active features of Mickey Hot Springs of the lower group. This spring, or event nearby, was described as a nearly invisible hole in the grass in 1992, but it has clearly evolved over the past 25 years. So here is a photo from 2007, and you could see that this is another spring we'll discuss in a second called UTF 20, but UTF 19 should be right here. It is here today. It's not here in 2007 or in the 1990s. In 2008 or 2009, UTF 19 broke out, or greatly expanded, and it became a boiling or perpetually spouting spring that carved out this gourd shaped crater and eventually connected to UTF 20. Now, that boiling and perpetual spouting activity did regress back into kind of more of quiet bubbling at about 2014. But in 2017, when I started studying Mickey Hot Springs for my undergraduate degree, this is what I came to. You could see here, there's evidence that, like several of these other innocuous looking features, it erupted, probably sometime that previous winter. This wash extended for at least 3 feet outward, and it threw out cinder rocks that were the size of my fist or even bigger. This overhang here on the pool is at least a foot high, which tells you that in order to get wash all the way across this peninsula and outward 3 or 4 feet, must have been a pretty significant eruption. So once again, if you're visiting Mickey Hot Springs, you want to check out all the springs because it seems like darn near anything in this thermal area can erupt when it wants to. Now, UTF 20 is a large, roughly T-shaped spring that dominates the lower group and contributes to, I'd say, most of the discharge. The average temperature of this spring in 2018 was about 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's covered by a large portion of this silty deposit here at the bottom, which creates these kind of pretty formations down on the bottom. Now, right next to UTF 20, we have UTF 23, but most people know it as Mickey Geyser. Now, Mickey Geyser was once considered Oregon's only true natural geyser, and so it's been the primary interest for geyser enthusiasts and researchers visiting Mickey Hot Springs. Um, Mickey's has evolved over the years a lot. I've gone through and kind of done a timeline here for you. Currently, its crater is two pools of water separated by a little bridge of center, perforated by several erupting vents. The northern pool is the original one, and then it kind of vents decrease in age as you go south. Mickey Geyser has been active as a perpetual spouter, cyclic spouter, and periodic geyser since its discovery in 1986, and I've found records of activity for almost every year. So when the BLM first observed Mickey in 1986, it was described as a small spouter. And when Geyser Associates first visited the area in 1990, they found it was a little cyclic spouter in this crater here, where it had small eruptions preceded by a little rise in water level. By that fall, Mickey had increased its vigor, and its eruptions out of this little crater were reaching 3 feet high and 4 feet outward and excavating a significant splash zone, which was developing into 1991. This is a photo from 1991. This is Geyser Gazer Marie Wolf watching an eruption here. And in 1991, it was observed with eruptions 4 feet high that spring, lasting 30 to 40 seconds, which was largely eroding the vent. Now, in May, only about 2 months after this picture was taken, it was erupting up to 9 feet high, fully 9 feet high with jetting eruptions. And the intervals were long enough the basic statistics were taken, and it was shown to be bimodal in nature. A year later, it was kind of regressing back to a cyclic spouter, which it kind of stayed through until 1993 here. This is where you can see here, here's the original vent that's in 1990. But as time has gone on, activity has marched its way south, breaking out different vents. So this is a photo in 1993 of this new vent where the original vent is quite quiet in this photo. Now, the large activity seen in 1993 and 1991 was probably responsible for breaking out this second vent. But by 1994, it was a cyclic spouter erupting up to 3 feet with pauses lasting 7 to 15 seconds. Now, following the observations of 1993 and 94, there was kind of a gap. There was one visit in 1996 when it was still kind of behaving as a perpetual spouter with not a whole lot of overflow here. Now, online photos show that Mickey Geyser had developed the rest of its vents currently present by 1999 and was probably still eruptive or at least boiling, as you can see here in this photo. But the next observations were recorded 5 years later by a geyser gazer in 2004. And that geyser gazer observed cyclic behavior, describing foot-high near-perpetual eruptions with occasional 2-foot larger bursts. He actually had a data logger on it for a time. He did have data with it that he shared with me in my undergraduate study. It's just one of those things we do not have time to cover tonight. It's going to have to be a whole other webinar. Hint, hint. In 2007, you can see here that it continues perpetual activity, and this is kind of how it looks in the modern day. You have 2 pools here. There's a bridge of center between them. The larger pool, it houses the newer vents, and there is overflow to the south, which now runs into UTF-20. Now, sometime between 2008 and 2009, there was a marked shift at Mickey Geyser. In June of 2009, a geyser gazer wrote in the Sput that he observed Mickey Geyser looking like a pathetic little hole. with no evidence of the past runoff channel and the water only bubbling deep within the deepest hole. Now, this remained the case at least into 2012 and all the way into 2014 from what my research shows. You could see it's quite a marked change where it lost almost all of its water, almost all of its eruptive activity. And something else happened during that time that maybe you picked up on earlier in the presentation, and if not, we'll circle back to that near the end. Now, we're starting to get more into the modern day here. Mickey Geyser reactivated sometime between March and May of 2014. In the spring of 2015, geyser gazers observed it with frequent 1-foot eruptions and varying pool levels. And all the activity had basically shifted over to the newer pool and the newer vents here, which is on the right. Again, this is the southern direction, and the original vent is this left-hand pool here. Similar activity continued through 2016, and into 2017, this is how it basically looks today. 2 pools, bridge a center, original vent, the newer vent with the heavy discharge going over to UTF 20. Now, when I first arrived in March of 2017, it was mostly still perpetual bubbling from mostly these newer vents. There was another vent kind of in the corner of the original pool right here that also had minor perpetual activity, but I'm suspicious that it was occurring from underneath the bridge here and not actually from the original vent. Now that all changed that May when I came in and just about had a heart attack because a surprising significant shift had occurred. There was strong perpetual bursting from the original vent observed in 1990 and described until 1993. It was an energetic bursting 2 to 4 feet high and 3 feet outward. Now, as you can see here, the thick layer of soil, bacteria, and vegetation that was present immediately around the crater in this photo has been mostly washed away. Further from the vent, you can see it's even killed up to a radius of maybe 2 feet or so. With as thick as this bacteria and soil layer is, at least a foot thick, and the fact that it's exposed this center shelf here, this is probably the most significant activity that's happened since it was having those major eruptions to 9 feet in 1991 to 3. Now, by July, when I returned again, we had switched back into the newer vents were dominating the activity here. And you could see the original vent is completely quiet again, and grass is beginning to regrow, but that center shelf remained exposed for the entire rest of my undergraduate study through March of 2018. So during this time, we'll discuss in the future, Mickey was also having what I describe as intermediate eruptions, where my data logger, very hard to pick up visually, but the data logger was detecting the pool would rise by an inch, and all the activity in the minor vents here would surge up and be erupting 6 inches to a foot, where all of this would be white water, and the overflow would nearly double. I was trying to figure out a way where I could slip in some form of analysis on those intermediate eruptions. It's going to have to be its whole entire other webinar. Tonight's just the Reader's Digest on Mickey Hot Springs. Okay. Now, just down the slope from Mickey Geyser, as far as I know, all current activity has regressed back to this perpetual spouting. We did have observations in 2019 and 2020 by other geyser gazers, and I am hoping to get to Mickey Hot Springs again this summer. But moving down the slope to some of the other features past Mickey, we have UTF 26. Now, this spring was initially described in 1992 as a small spring contributing a little bit to the discharge of the lower group. UTF 26 has changed quite a bit in the recent years. Sometime between March and May of 2014, an apparent energy surge or shift hit the lower group of Mickey Hot Springs, resulting in, you could see here it was an original crater about kind of circular, and maybe there might be the little hint of a fracture here going away from the crater. But when this thing got hit by that energy surge in 2014, you could see here that a fracture unzipped. And this fracture opened up here, and the spring became a cyclic spouter that was bursting anywhere from, I'd say 6 inches to a foot. It was still doing that in 2017 when I first saw it. And it kind of regressed into 2018 until it was just a low boiling and roiling. Still definitely something to keep an eye on, though, if you visit the springs. And it is one of the hotter features in the group still. When I measured it in March of 2018, it was 196 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, we kind of jump back geographically closer to Mickey Geyser here, because right next to Mickey, we have UTF 27. This is a fascinating feature because it is a violent fumer hole in a small, shallow crater. There are times where you could hear this feature from the parking lot, which is several hundred feet away. But after heavy rainfall or storms, it becomes a perpetual spouter. It kind of behaves like a mini version of red spouter at fountain paint pots, where it can be a fumarole, hot spring, or geyser, depending on what time of year you visit or see it. And again, it is very loud. If you camp there at Mickey Hot Springs, it will be lulling you to sleep. And it is one of the hotter things at Mickey Hot Springs. I measured it at 204 degrees, which is boiling at that elevation. Now, UTF 28 is right next to Mickey Geyser, and it is the newest feature, or one of the newer features at Mickey Hot Springs. This is a geyser. It has basically been a geyser since it broke out. As far as I can tell, I have scoured the internet, and this feature broke out sometime between September 1st and October 22nd of 2016. When it first broke out, it was having kind of small jetting eruptions through a jagged vent about 3 feet high, and it has slowly excavated this crater. These photos from 2017 are showing it as I saw it first. It is now expanded to where it is horseshoe shaped, and it has frequent eruptions up to 3 feet, maybe even 4 feet. The pauses are small. We're not talking intervals of minutes here. We're talking intervals of maybe 15 to 30 seconds. During the longer pauses, the water level in this crater does drop noticeably by up to several inches. And so these drops in water level and these long pauses, they fit the criteria of a geyser to me. And so this is definitely something that, since it is one of the newer features at Mickey Hot Springs, it's worth checking out if you visit and kind of noting down what it's up to. So those are the significant features at Mickey Hot Springs. Really briefly, I do want to touch on that from 2017 to 2018, as part of my undergraduate study at Central Washington, I had 3 data loggers at Mickey Hot Springs. So the red data logger here was on Mickey Geyser itself. The blue data here was on UTF 26, which is the one with the fracture vent that broke out. And then the green was on the outflow for the entire lower group. Now, I do want to point out, if any of you were present for Mara Reed's discussion on the amazing stuff that she's doing at Norris Geyser Basin at Steamboat, she told you about that little pattern that she was noticing of that oscillating pattern. Now, that was an infrasound and seismic data, but there have been discussions amongst geyser gazers that same oscillating pattern that she has discussed shows up in the temperature data at Norris as well. What do you suppose this is? It looks very similar to that bouncing pattern that you see at Norris Geyser Basin that Mara is studying. And I've been calling attention to it, or trying to, since I first saw it in I think I noticed it in about 2017 as I was downloading the data loggers. It is not a diurnal pattern, if any of you are wondering. It is not day and night. These periods are anywhere from From the bottom to the bottom here is about 3 to 5 days. And from what I can best tell, this might be indicative of periodic boiling within the chamber that supplies water and heat to the entirety of Mickey Hot Springs. Still a lot of more data analysis to be made and more study to be had. But also, these spikes here are those intermediate eruptions that I picked up from Mickey Geyser. And I do want to point out, look how similar this pattern is between Mickey Geyser and UTF 26. And I'm going to use that to segue into at Mickey Hot Springs, even though it's such a small thermal area, geologist George Marler in the mid 20th century talks about this amazing pattern that makes up a lot of our geyser gazing hobby, exchange of function. And I do believe that there are inner spring dynamics and exchanges of function in Mickey Hot Springs. The most obvious would be between Mickey Geyser and UTF 28, which is right next door. These two show general sympathy in the strength of their boiling eruptions. During those intermediate eruptions of Mickey Hot Spring, Mickey Geyser, UTF 28 did appear to have an increase in activity. This little geyser here, UTF 28, is a bear to log if you are a geyser gazer that likes to write notes. I remember me and Tara Cross in a visit in April of 2018 were getting so desperate that we were trying to log it based on the overflows. And I still don't have a good way to log the activity of UTF 28. But what I do want to point out is that there has been a general sympathy between those two features. Now, when UTF 19 broke out in 2009, I do want to point out, if you remember, 2009 is also the exact same year that Mickey Geyser went dormant. So just the fact that this feature suddenly broke out and had major activity and excavated this entire crater the same year that the major geyser of the thermal area went dormant, that's pretty suspicious to me that there might be a subterranean connection there, and that could be a perfect example of an exchange of function where all of the heat and energy from Mickey Geyser went over to the west to UTF 19 and caused it to break out and excavate this crater and increase in its activity. Now, Mickey Geyser and UTF 26, this is a more modern, the photo I showed you earlier of UTF 26 was 2014. This is a 2017 photo. I noticed I couldn't zoom in very much on the logger photo there. That's, again, going to have to be for another webinar. But on the data logger, those two were joined at the hip. Every little temperature fluctuation in Mickey Geyser was seen at UTF 26. On my map, which I will scroll back to here, of the lower group, boop, 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 boop. Photos are really not liking to show up on this shared screen. In the lower group here, UTF 26 is several hundred feet from Mickey Geyser. But in the data logger record, they are joined at the hip. And so just due to that sympathy that they show on the data logger and the fact that there's no channels connecting them and there's quite the distance between the two, I'd say it's worth being suspicious that those two share an underground connection. I do also want to point out that in 2014, when this fracture opened up on UTF 26, that was the same year that Mickey Geyser, you could just barely see here, it's overflowing and it has started erupting again after that several-year dormancy where it was low and almost empty. So there's a lot of dynamics going on here. Again, these features I've been describing are all crammed into an area only an acre across. So common sense does seem to indicate that they all have some sort of connection, but just the degree of intimacy between them, really interesting stuff that makes it well worth it to visit this little thermal area. And I'd say, you can walk the whole group in an hour. But I really got a lot of beneficial information and interesting observations from spending even 2 full days there camping there. It's There's a lot of secrets here to be found. So, what does that mean for if you decide to visit Mickey Hot Springs? Well, as hopefully this short, quick webinar has shown, it's a small area with a few hydrothermal features, but it has geysers, and they're some of the only active geysers outside of Yellowstone National Park. And there's a lot more to cover. And you could see the activity is varied and changeable and highly dynamic and well worth your while to, even if you want to rent a little SUV that's going to take on that gravel road to it. If you're even a casual thermal enthusiast, it's well worth your time. On the more technical side of things, again, one of the things we didn't cover here, I had to nuke several sections, was geochemistry of the springs. It is separated from other thermal areas in Yellowstone National Park in having a slightly different geochemistry. When I was studying it at Central Washington University, as it tends to go, the geochemical lab, some of the instrumentation broke down, so I couldn't get a full analysis of the chemistry aside from the cations. So if there's a geology student either listening in or that finds this webinar in the future, you might want to be interested in going to this group of springs and seeing how the geochemistry works out, because there's some interesting stuff there. And other things, other suggestions for future visits, um, the data logger deployment. Um, GOSA is launching a grants and gifts program. If you're a geology student or an independent researcher that maybe wants to, you have the time and the resources to do a long-term monitoring of Mickey Hot Springs, and you would like some help in maybe deploying loggers again, that's something to consider. That's what GOSA's mission is all about. And one final thing that, again, is kind of a teaser for next year's webinar series, which, by the way, Will has done an amazing job putting this on. And I hope that next year we have even more speakers, because this year's been fantastic. I mentioned that the upper group of Mickey Hot Springs has a lot of center formations, and you can use center to determine the activity of what that prehistoric feature used to do. I did it all the time in my tours in Yellowstone, where I would show people different features and show the different types of activity that formed the morphology of that center. That kind of study of the morphology of center and how you can use it to determine, was it a geyser, was it a hot spring, was it boiling, was it not boiling? There's over a dozen old craters and cones and features at Mickey that could be used as a template for determining how to use center in contemporary hot spring studies. So there's all manner of things that Mickey has to offer. And I guess the main point is that even though it's small, it does pack quite the punch. And so thank you for joining me on this little Reader's Digest of this unique thermal area in Oregon. And hopefully in the future I can tell you more about it in more detail, and I can add on to it based on what you guys have seen. So I will now open up the floor for a few minutes for photos and comments or snarky remarks, and we'll take a few minutes to answer your questions or thoughts. Okay, how many people were on? Sweet.
Okay, we got a few questions here for you, Micah.
All
Um,
right.
are there other thermal areas near enough to Mickey to visit in the same trip?
Are there other thermal areas in the area that are worth a visit aside from Mickey? Yes. Um, so the one that me and several other gazers have been giving the side eye to in recent years is called Borax Hot Springs. It is to the south of Mickey, south of the Alvord Desert, much closer to the little town of Fields, Oregon. It also has boiling hot springs with center formations, and there is at least one feature that, based on photographs and videos alone, it might be a geyser. It probably only a bubble shower or a boiling type geyser, but I mean it has the look and feel of a geyser. It's a whole line of springs along a fault line, and there has been geyser activity seen there in the past. I've had someone described me a 3 foot jetting eruption from one of the features there. So definitely worth checking out Borax Hot Springs as well. Yes.
Okay, and next question here. Uh, Hey, Mike, a quick question. Unless I just missed it while watching, what powers these geysers and hot springs there? Is it a hot spot like Yellowstone?
Ooh, good question. No, I did not touch on that. So, literally, what is powering Mickey Hot Springs and other similar fields like Steamboat Hot Springs and now dormant Biawawe geysers in Nevada are these fault tips that I mentioned in that geologic overview. There is such a high amount of fracturing, and the crust is extending, so it's thinner. So you have a higher amount of heat that's able to radiate to the surface and then work its way up through the faults. So there is no magma chamber underneath Mickey Hot Springs. There is no lava involved. It is literally just the radiant heat from the mantle that is coming up through these faults.
Okay, we'll probably just give it about another minute here. So if you have any other questions, feel free to go ahead and get those into chat. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and probably call it there for tonight. As a reminder, we did add one more presentation to this series. We are going to be back in 2 weeks. We are taking a break week here. We will have Graham on the 30th, and I want to make sure I get this right for his thing. Um, he will be doing economic activity in January 2024 and also the Penta mixed phase that he saw this last winter. And for everyone with the presentations, we do plan to do this next year. So think about maybe if you wanted to do a project or something over this summer. We will, if you wanted to ping any of like the board members or anybody that runs these, feel free to give us a ping if you for an idea, and we will be opening up probably officially very late summer, early fall in that range for actual applications to get on the presentation list for the series next year. So with that, we will see you all in 2 weeks.